I've mentioned it twice already.
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Onward panel event from Rust to Riches, delivering growth, homes and jobs in our cities. My name's Adam Hawksbee. I'm Deputy Director at Onward. I'm really pleased today to be having a discussion about a topic we've done a lot of research on, has been really central to our work, and in a week, after a conference in which towns were very much the focus, and there was a lot of emphasis on what we can do for our towns, I'm personally really pleased that we're having a conversation unashamedly and unabashedly about our cities and about the contribution that they can make to national growth, and in particular the kind of bigger contribution that they could make if we got certain parts of policy right. And today's conversation, I imagine, will particularly focus on some of the challenges and constraints around planning, around how we can get homes built in our cities that meet the high level of demand that we have, as well as the infrastructure that ensures that those homes, the people that live in those homes, are connected to opportunity, not just transport, but GP surgery, schools, all the rest of it. So I hope today we're going to get right into what the potential of our cities is, and what are some of the factors that's preventing us currently from reaching that potential. And I am really pleased to have a fantastic panel with me to do that. I'll introduce them very, very briefly. On my immediate right, we have Steve Rotherham, Mayor of the Liverpool City region. Particularly pleased, Steve, that we can host you here in your hometown and in a city where anyone that's kind of walking around can see some of the amazing things happening and some of the potential, both realised and untapped. On Steve's right, we have Mark Allan, the CEO of Landsec, an organisation doing a lot of the regeneration in some of the UK's core cities, who I have no doubt will talk about some of the work and the projects that they are engaged in. To the far left of the panel, we have Nicholas Boyce-Smith, who is the founding director of Create Streets and the chair of the government's Office for Place, someone who's done an enormous amount of work on how we can ensure that as we build homes, we do so in a way which creates places that are healthy, are happy, are prosperous, and which go with the grain of human behaviour. And then to my immediate left, Dr. Anna Valero, the Growth Programme Director at the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE, also a member of the Chancellor's Economic Advisory Council. Have I got that right? There we go. So someone who is feeding ideas directly into the Treasury and into government on how we need to unblock growth, and I think in particular how we can realise some of the agglomeration potential of our cities. So wide range of experience on this panel. I'm sure we're going to have a fantastic chat. What we're going to do is have 4 or 5 minute opening remarks from each member of the panel. We'll then come out to you guys for some questions. I apologise that this room is slightly warm. It's a sort of exact replica of the docking station of the Death Star. I don't know why they've done that, but it's fun. It's a sort of novelty. But bear with us. I promise you we'll get to those questions, and there'll be a chance for as many people as possible to input. But without further ado, Steve, I'd love to hear your opening thoughts on this topic. How do we realise the potential of our cities?
Well, I welcome Keir's contribution this week and his commitment to reforming the planning system. But my starting point for all this is not just a policy one. Our local authorities, after 13 years of austerity, have been hollowed out. And unless we build capacity and understanding and expertise within our local authorities, then it really doesn't matter what we do about planning policy. We simply can't get things through the sausage machine because it's already... we can't get things through the sausage machine because the thing's clogged. And so we need some commitment that we can attract some of the types of people back into local authorities that were lost when local authorities had that unenviable decision to take about keeping people on who were, had decent salaries, or letting them go and then keeping 2 people on a lesser salary. So we need that top end sorting out. And also as well, we need a real clear steer, don't we, on things. I was speaking to Angela Rayner, and she's talking about council housing, again, building council housing, which is enormously important for an area like ours because it's about having that mix. And we've got some private developers, as you can imagine, who are doing some wonderful things. We've got the opportunity for a garden village, and we've also got things like if you remember going back to the 80s, anybody, the Tories robbed us of every single penny that we could possibly have, but then said, well, we'll give you some flowers, and so they give us the Garden Festival. And that site then, which was an old municipal tip and was covered over, and we got some nice plants, that has had to have been remediated, and all of that toxic waste taken out, and now it's to a stage where we're looking for a significant development partner with Liverpool City Council. And you can do all of these wonderful things because we have devolution. Devolution is the important part in all of these strategies. So I want our government to be working with devolved authorities, but to give us the flexibilities within the planning regime to do what's right in our areas, whilst of course I always appreciate that you have to have a national plan and policy framework.
Thank you very much, Steve. And let's go into that devolution question in just a moment, because I think it's an important one. I'm particularly keen to understand kind of where the Labour Party are moving on this and what plans they might have. But let's open up the conversation. Mark, Landsec are doing a huge number of these projects in our cities. What are some of the things that have enabled you to do those projects well, and what are some of the barriers, particularly in relation to the planning system, that still exist?
Yeah, well, firstly, good afternoon, everyone. I mean, let me give a little bit of context to Landsec and what we're about as a business. The first thing I would say, and perhaps the clue is in the title of the fringe event here, but we are unashamedly a cities business. And that's not to say that we don't believe in towns, but we are a large-scale business with around £12 billion invested in different cities across the UK. And I think it's important for business to be clear about what it can do and what it can't do. And for us, we need to look for large-scale opportunities to invest in multiple phases over multiple years into our cities. And of that 12 billion, about 50% of that is invested in London, and the other half is invested or to be invested in cities outside of London. So perhaps just a couple of words on what we look for in a city to invest in. And I think that there are three things. And there, of course, there are varying degrees of public sector responsibility or opportunity in each of these. But we certainly look at the infrastructure, and particularly the transport infrastructure within a region. We see that as being critical in moving people around fundamentally, or goods around, to where they're needed in order to create jobs, to create economic growth. The second thing we look for, and it's something I personally feel very passionately about within cities, is universities and graduate retention as a way of attracting skills, developing skills within a city, but then retaining and reinvesting that skills back into the local economy. And all of the cities where we invest have very healthy levels of graduate retention and real opportunity, not just from those graduates, but from the universities themselves in supporting start-up and sort of scale-up businesses. And the third thing that we look for is, I'll call it stable and progressive local political leadership. Now, there are a good number of places in the UK that meet those criteria, which I would say is obviously good news. And we invest as a business somewhere between 500 million and £1 billion each year into opportunities in those cities. And those might be office-led, workplace-led mixed-use projects. They may be retail-led, leisure-led, or they may increasingly have a large residential element to them, which is quite new to Landsec as a business, but increasingly important to us. And in simple terms, if we had a planning system that was more effectively resourced, was less complex, and recognised that perhaps the question to answer is how do we accelerate brownfield regeneration rather than make putting identikit housing on green fields the key planning debate, we would double that level of investment, and we have investors that would come in and would do that. So where it becomes, of course, more challenging is then offering all the solutions to exactly what is it that make that. But that's the size, I think, of the prize. And great to hear earlier today, equally, last week at the conference in, I could just call it the conference in Manchester. Is that close enough? Both main political parties realise that we have to have a sustainable and credible growth agenda in order to create the wealth, the opportunities to invest in public services, to invest back into our cities. So I'll just offer some thoughts there in terms of what we see as the size of the prize, but certainly to Steve's earlier point, the resourcing. And of course, I know that your point goes far beyond simply the planning departments, but for the bit that we particularly look at, that drastic reduction in resourcing has been a significant challenge.
Thank you very much, Mark. And again, I want to dive into some of those planning kind of nuances alongside some of the stuff on devolution once we've done the opening remarks. Nicholas, let's turn to you. You've done a lot of work, hands-on work with areas around the country. What is it about the planning system that is holding back growth and housing supply, particularly in our cities?
Thank you. Yes, so we do a mixture of policy work, but also working as master planners and working for councils, landowners, developers, and above all, community and neighbourhood groups. I think the key question to have in your mind as we have this discussion is what is the difference between a deliberative case-by-case decision-making process versus clear regulation. That's the theme that's going to run through just the next couple of minutes of my thoughts. So look, point one, we've always, by we I mean humanity, we have always regulated the built environment, above all in cities, literally as far back as we have evidence. So if you look at, there are extant evidence that clearly the Romans, the Greeks, Indo-Europeans in northwest India, we've always done this because there are externalities in cities. If I own house A and Anna owns house B next to me, and I have a thatch on my house and it burns down and burns her house down as well, maybe she can come back at me in common law. She'd probably just rather I hadn't had thatch on my house, which is why we've had rules in the City of London where we've got good records going back over nearly 1,000 years against having thatch on your houses in the city. So it's just something the state does. Point one. Point two is that planning, and many of the things that go with it, maybe that's starting to change over the last few years, but I'm not sure, actually remains politically incredibly popular. The Green Belt, the creation of the planning system went alongside the creation of the National Trust, protecting our charity, protecting our greenery, the membership of environmental and nature-focused organisations. This is something that certainly as the Conservative Party, I think as Labour Party knows, this is something that's very, very hard to touch. And assuming that were Labour to win the next election, we'll have a bunch of seats in places where this is very, very totemic. So this is hard to do and goes right to the heart of many people's sense of what they are and or how they spend their weekends, which is perhaps the same thing. Third point, just very quickly, is, and this is perhaps the key one that builds on both of those, is over the last 70 years, we've essentially been running an experiment with our planning system, which is that we've run it differently to most other countries. Australia and New Zealand and Ireland were far more similar to ours, but they've moved away from it for good reasons, I would say. And this goes to the heart of Steve's point about the sausage machine. We have much weaker local plans than most countries. Most countries have a more regulatory document which sets with much greater clarity what you can and can't do. Now, there's an advantage to our system, which is it's much easier to do the weird and the wonderful and have a very contextual and thought through and expert response to a very specific situation. That's the upside of our situation. The downside is that clearly it creates much greater barriers to entry and costs when your right to develop is at risk. So I was talking to a journalist last week who told me that she'd now spent, I think it was £40,000, trying to get planning permission to knock down her current 1950s house and replace it with another house. We've got, almost certainly, and certainly of all the data I've seen, we've got the smallest self-build, the smallest custom build, some of the smallest reliance on SME builders, on local builders, in the Western world. Now, this is not an attack on planning, it's just it's a consequence of how we choose to run it. So this is all coming to my point. So the problem with, we've got a Rolls-Royce system, which if it was amazingly staffed, would be amazing. I would posit that it'll never be amazingly staffed. I think it ever has been. It probably was better staffed than it is now. So I think we need to find ways. And this is not, as I say, this is not an attack on planning, but we need to find the ways. The phrase I've used in the past is to bring the democracy forward. Developers or officials who ask us to take the democracy out of planning, that's naive. It will never happen, and it shouldn't happen. How we use land, my impact on you, your impact on me, that isn't necessarily and unavoidably political. It should be political. But we need to find mechanisms with public trust to take out some of the risk on a case-by-case basis and bring more of it into the local plan. and just one more, sorry, you probably want to move on. Just one more quick point, if I may, and that links then to our confidence as a society in the quality of the places we create and how we steward existing places. In a YouGov poll done a few years ago, 2% of the public, I think it was done for Grosvenor, I think someone from Grosvenor's in the room, 2% of the public trusted developers to create new places that would improve existing places. And if you take that to a planning audience, they smile and nod and say, yes, but us planners are better. For planners, the figure's 7%. So that the public trust in the quality of places we create is just not good enough. So this is not going to happen overnight. And no, the planning and developing and house building and city regeneration is not an overnight game. But we've got to find mechanisms to improve public trust by bringing that democracy forward into the local plan, and so that the quality asks are clear. It could be affordable housing, it could be street trees on new streets, it could be the beauty of the streets and the places we create, so that a much higher proportion of people in cities and indeed out of cities have confidence. Their instinctive response when they hear that development is happening is that this will make their places better and this could create an extension to their quality of life and their homes. I can do on that for some while, but I'll stop there.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you, Nicholas. Anna, let's come to you. So you've heard about kind of some of the projects in Liverpool, some of the work that's happening in cities across the country, and then some of the specifics of the planning system and its obstacles. You've done a lot of work on the impact of those obstacles, what happens when the planning system doesn't work. Share some of your reflections with us.
Great, thank you, and it's great to be here. So, I'm coming at this from the perspective of an economist that really cares about growth in the UK, which is something that has been elusive, particularly productivity growth, which is really the source to sustainable growth in the long run and rising living standards. And it's clear that there's no plausible route to us improving our productivity performance without focusing on our cities. This has been a message coming out of two major pieces of work that I've been involved in. First, the Economy 2030 inquiry that released two papers, one on Birmingham, one on Manchester, and also the UK Urban Futures Commission, which is a partnership between the Royal Society of the Arts and core cities. So cities are where most of the population lives and works. Our large cities outside of London are really underperforming relative to London, but also relative to second cities in other countries. So if you take the Paris-Lyon gap, it's around 20%, whereas the London-Greater Manchester gap is 35%. So this is something we need to address. Because many people are there, if we raise the productivity, that will have an impact on the aggregate economy. Investment is fundamental to narrowing these gaps. Public sector investment, but crucially private sector investment, where we know we've been investing around 2 to 3 percentage points less as a share of GDP than our main comparators. So a number of levers are needed when we look at our cities, but it's clear that planning and effective use of the planning system is really important, particularly because of the fact there are all these externalities, interactions, competing demands on land that need to be managed. So at the national level, we did quite a big report looking at the barriers to business investment in the UK. Planning really came out as being one of the major ones. And the way we frame this is there are some barriers to investment in the UK which come from firms not potentially wanting to invest for the long term, so perhaps short-termism, other things. Planning is actually something that affects businesses that want to invest and then can't invest in the place where they want to invest. And so it has a direct impact on business investment when, say, a lab can't expand in Cambridge or Oxford and the high-tech cluster associated with it can't grow, when workers can't live in the places where there's the most demand for them, when energy infrastructure, other infrastructure can't happen, which we know is needed, not only for growth but also security. So we've heard a bit about how there are some issues in the UK, but is this particularly an issue in the UK versus other countries? A wide literature in economics suggests it is, and a number of government reports and also the white paper a couple of years back kind of set out why there are these problems. And actually reflecting that in the data is this phenomenon whereby the UK hasn't seen any increase in the amount of built-up land per capita since 1990, whereas other advanced economies have. Now, you might say, but that's because we're protecting more land. The reality is, actually, some of the other countries, particularly Germany and the Netherlands, they have a higher share of protected land than the UK, but they've still managed to do more built-up land per capita over this time. And it's not due to density. Other countries with a similar density also have managed to build up. So, in fact, we know our cities are particularly low density versus other countries, and density is actually good in terms of getting those commuting times down and also for greenness of our cities. So density, it makes it easier to have some of the kind of net zero outcomes that we want. So I suppose just to echo Nicholas a bit, some of the issues with our system relate to this case-by-case decision-making. Local communities tend to engage in the planning process on an ex-post basis instead of kind of at the ex-ante, so strategic point where you can think about what's the vision for this place. So that means that developments can be refused even when they meet the specifications of a local plan. In fact, around 60% of local authorities in England don't have an up-to-date plan. Resourcing, as has been mentioned, of the planning system itself has been a key issue, and we saw today some announcements from Rachel Reeves on additional resourcing there. So we need to make sure that plans are up to date and that they're binding. They need to be simpler, more proactive, with zoning, some form of zoning. So if something is kind of in a zone that is for economic development, that should be allowed to go ahead. But allowing communities to be involved and actually feel the benefits and believe that they will feel the benefits of development in their local place. And of course, this should be combined with some level of nationally determined priorities when it comes to things like infrastructure. And again, we heard some announcements on that. So briefly, two other points. The other is on level of plans, and I think this hasn't been mentioned yet so much, but because particularly for housing, but also economic development, plans are made at a very local level. But the reality is that economic benefits are felt at a wider functional economic area, which you might think of as like the travel to work area, the area where people are kind of coming and working. So what we need is better coordination when it comes to the commercial development and some aspects of the housing development, because those benefits are felt at a more diffuse level, but the political costs of a particular development in a local place are felt very locally. There are some mechanisms in place to allow for voluntary working together of local authorities, but that's not necessarily binding. And then again, this was mentioned, but local decision makers face limited economic incentives because of the fact they're not able to retain much of the fiscal benefits of local developments. So there are kind of reasons to want wholesale reform of the planning system in the UK. That is politically quite difficult, as we've seen, but within the current frameworks, there are things that could be improved. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So, Steve, let me come to you on the question that Anna just raised, this kind of level of plans question. You, I believe, are embarking upon a regional spatial plan at the moment. You're kind of through the process of that. We had Oliver Coppard here earlier this morning who said that if he had the powers to, he would kind of relish the opportunity or wanted to go ahead and do that. But there are other regions where, for whatever reason, people have been hesitant to engage in some of the political difficulties of developing a regional plan, to put it mildly. What level should we be thinking about doing planning? Is it at the common authority level, the local authority level, district councils, whatever else? How should we be thinking about this?
If Oliver was here, I'd say be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
So it is absolutely fraught. So we've got a spatial development strategy, but because of the ever-changing national government methodologies to calculate what we needed in certain areas, if the formula that we used resulted in higher levels than our local authorities, and then the local plans of a local authority, that then was a hostage to fortune for political shenanigans, should we call it.
Yep.
So it's much more difficult trying to get those to line up, although, of course, with some of the announcements that we've heard over the last few days, hopefully that's going to be easier for us. But look, I'll simplify this. I'm a builder by trade. I'm a bricklayer by trade. So I know about how to build the things, and it's for the professions really to come up with how we calculate either the number that we need or where they need to go. But the strategy should identify, I think Anna said about zones. I think this is really important. We need to start thinking about place rather than just a building or a series of buildings. So what does that place need? If it is housing, what are the ancillary support mechanisms that need to be built alongside that so that you start to build communities? And the reason that I say that is because my family were moved out of Liverpool city centre, Anfield, in the late 50s, early 60s. And we were moved to what was genuinely described as being a new utopia. It was called Kirby Newtown. If you've ever seen Z cars, then that was Kirby Newtown. And basically, one of my mates is a comedian called John Bishop, and he used to say, in Runcorn, you had a pub and a chippy, and then all of a sudden he thought, oh, there's a community, you know, we'll build a community around that. We have to get away from just building buildings. We have to start building places where people want to live and bring the kids up and develop relationships and get that social cohesion. Plans on pieces of paper won't do that alone. It has to be about that spatial development, about thinking about things for the long term rather than short term targets set by national government. So for me, devolution is the right level. A city region is not too big, but not small enough so that if you think about how bitty that would become, literally with perhaps roads, you know, and small, very small parcels of land all being allocated for different things. I think it makes much more sense. And then we can build things around transport strategies for that. And I know it was mentioned very briefly before, skills strategies as well. I mean, when we want to do all these wonderful things, and you'll see the numbers, when you count them all together, when they're assessed in a single year, who's going to build all of these wonderful things that we've heard of? You know, we heard HS2 being scrapped, and hundreds of individual projects are going to be built. Well, are they? Because we haven't got the skills base currently, and it's only at a sub-regional level you can start to put those pieces of the jigsaw together. So I'd like a skills pipeline, so that when we do some of the spatial development planning, and then we start with developers to build out those parcels, that we've got a throughput. National government can't do it. It's too big. It's a monolithic structure in Whitehall and Westminster, but we can do that.
Mark, you used a really interesting phrase in your remarks about the sort of local government you wanted to work with or look for, stable and progressive. And I guess I wanted to ask about what are the kind of signals of seriousness that you might see from a city. So that might be, you know, that they've got planning in place, they've resourced the particular bit of local government that you're going to deal with. They maybe have something in place like a development corporation or a kind of special purpose vehicle or something like that. What are things you look for from a place where you say, okay, they're serious about working with us and engaging?
So I think, first of all, somebody or a team that is talking passionately about their vision for the place, the city that they want to be. Now, there's a lot of things I'll hear from city leaders that will be very kind of consistent across others. You know, so everyone will say, I want to promote life sciences, the creative and tech sectors, and there isn't a single city leader that I've spoken to that doesn't want to do those things, and realistically we're not all going to be able to do all of those things to the same extent. So I think it's got to be a passionate but credible vision that is then backed up with the apparatus and the structure to actually turn that into reality. And the second thing I would say is a genuine approach to partnership. And of course, that's a two-way thing. You have to, you know, build trust in both directions. But the most successful projects that we have brought forward or are bringing forward are always characterised by a bit of give and take on both sides. And to this point, sort of plans and where plans should sit. I mean, it seems to me that things are changing on a sort of more rapid basis as we go forward. And you know, we own a number of shopping centres. Now, all those shopping centres, you know, there's a strategy, we're going back, you know, maybe 20, 30 years ago initially, of building large covered malls in cities. And that's, you know, progressed and adapted over time, as that was what was required. But in a lot of cases now, we've ended up with shopping centres that are no longer fit for purpose. We've ended up with others that are worth about a third of what they were at the peak of the market, but actually are serving a need. But a lot of the changes that led to actually what communities and society wanted from those places, those changes were actually happening whilst some of those projects were being conceived or going through planning. It just takes such a long time, and if plans become overly rigid, then it's, you know, it's only the point of having a plan if it's still a sensible plan. If you're just continuing down a route that no longer makes any sense, it's not going to end well.
Sort of trying to turn the oil tanker, and you can kind of see it's going in the wrong direction, but it takes a while.
So adaptability, and that needs that partnership and mutual trust.
Very interesting. Let's open it up, because I'm sure that folks have questions in the room. A hand shot up immediately there. So I'll take a few, and then we will answer those. So let's take the one in the middle there, the one at the front here, and I will take the one just over there, and then we will do another round.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Feasy from the Horticultural Trade Association. So I was delighted to hear Steve mention the Garden Festival within a few minutes of this panel session starting. Really interested to hear from the panellists how they think green spaces, which can deliver on many of the challenges facing our cities, can be better integrated into the planning and not just delivered, but also maintained as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. I would commend a fantastic report called Greening Up, which has just been written by Nicholas, which I'm
no, by my team. I didn't write a word.
Which I'm sure he'll talk about in a moment. Yes, question here from the front.
Thank you. Victoria Hills Royal Town Planning Institute. Just wondered, Nicholas mentioned bringing democracy forward. Current government tried that a couple of years back, and it resulted in a massive revolt that none of us were expecting. And meant that the white paper had to basically start again, and we've now got the levelling up white paper or bill, which is effectively a planning bill. So I just wondered what reflections the panel may have, whether or not an incoming Labour government, for example, would have the appetite to address that cultural change that clearly there was no appetite for when it was tried a couple of years back. And then a question for Anna. Is the only way to really drive forward that level of planning reform by having more local fiscal devolution? We've looked a lot at what goes on with planning in the States, and part of the reason their communities put up with stuff is they get to keep the tax base. Communities here don't. So just interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Excellent. It's an Onward event now. We're talking about fiscal devo. This is great. Let's then take the other question from back there on the right.
Hi, thank you. My name's Ellie. I'm the Deputy Assistant Mayor for Housing in Leicester City. And I've obviously been around quite a few of the sort of housing and asylum fringe events over the last couple of days. And one thing that comes through is everybody believes that we should have an inclusive planning system which responds to local need, where you're building places and you're involving the community and what that might look like. Given that there is no more money at the moment and we can't invest in the resources required to have that Rolls-Royce planning system, what planning or regulatory reform would people from the outside the sector like to see to be able to, break down some of those barriers, but in the context also of making sure that local authorities are at the table having those conversations, because it very often feels from a local authority point of view that it's developer-led. And in fact, actually, if we are going to build these communities and everybody agrees that we need to concentrate on place and communities, local authorities need to be part of that conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Steve, let me direct a couple of these questions to you first, because I think you need to run in about 5 minutes or so I'll give you a chance to chip in. In particular, Victoria's two questions. So one on, the Labour Party over the last couple of days have really emphasised some big and bold changes around planning. They are likely, if implemented, to elicit a backlash. What's your advice to them on steeling themselves against that backlash? And then the question on fiscal devo. What tax powers would you like the shadow levelling up team to be pledging to you ahead of the election?
Well, I know Victoria, and I was hoping she wouldn't ask the second one. But I'll be honest, because there was a paper that Jamie Driscoll did a few years ago, which was on fiscal devolution. It's really important and interesting, but there's things that we don't do that you could do quite easily. So land value uplift, for instance, is not a biggie, but it would make the affordability of some of the things that we want to do in our city region. So I want to take trains to all wonderful places. Some of those will be underground stations perhaps, and then what happens with the bit above it, and then if you could include that as part of the package, then you'll start to see that it starts to wash its face. So there's simple things like that. I'd like to do an awful lot of trialling, and I've spoken to government about if they just wanted to pilot something just to see whether it does have the desired effect, rather than going for the big bang and everybody does it and then it's a failure and then we start again. So we've not had anything positive back so far on that particular one, to tell you the truth. But the second half of the question was...
So the Genric reforms basically hit a brick wall got mired in controversy. So how does Labour, if they go into government, avoid that controversy again?
Well, the great thing that everyone says is that you need to go out and consult, don't you? And that was part of the problem. We went out and consulted, and then everybody says, yeah, I'm all for instance, housing. I think we're in a desperate need for more housing, but just nowhere near me. And we need more housing, but not on any greenfield. And we need more housing, and it just goes on and on with those sorts of excuses. We have to accept that planning issues are never popular. That I can't think of anything when I was a councillor that came before us that everybody universally went, you know what, that's a great idea. That, but yeah, people would say, I wouldn't mind something like that, but just not where I happen to be the representative of the community, because they're always problematic. And actually, I think lots of the schemes don't properly tease out what the benefits to local communities might be. So, for instance, about creating apprenticeships and jobs and sustainability in the green spaces, I absolutely agree with that. We have to start looking at public realm in a completely different way. So there's a whole host of different things that could be added into it, but most of them are fueled by social media and anti-whatever it is campaigns. Doesn't matter what the campaign is, there's always the anti-side of it. And that seems to be the zeitgeist at the moment, that there's more people who will be against something than would positively support it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. I'm conscious you need to run. Thank you so much for joining us and for welcoming us to your region and to your city. Mm-hmm. So while you do run, let's just give Steve some of our appreciation.
Thanks,
Adam. Nicholas, let me turn to you on this question about green space, because I know you've got kind of strong views on this and some really good practical advice. So how can we make sure that as we're doing some of these developments, particularly in cities, we do so in a way that encourages, supports, promotes green space?
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the right to plug a Create Streets report at an Onward event. That's very kind of you. Brilliant question.
You're far too enthusiastic about the report.
Yeah, no, I was leaning forward too much. I'll lean back again. Yes, I do commend you have a look at the Greening Up report on the Create Streets website. It's brilliant. We made two or three quick points, which I think are very much a response to your excellent question. One is that the data, as I'm sure you know, but I don't think it is generally known, the data of the well-being consequences of urban greenery and city greenery for people, for planet, and for place and prosperity is really just staggeringly strong. I won't go into it now, but trust me, it is. So this is something we should be doing. Two, it's almost more about access than it is about total volume. So there was some research a while ago showing that most people won't move more than about 2.5 blocks to go to a park. Even if it's a bit more than that, I'm slightly doubtful on how broad the data is on that. So proximity really matters, particularly if you've got young children. So street trees, the data on street trees is staggeringly strong. There are no-brainers in urban design, but plant more street trees is as close as you will empirically get to one. So access matters. So some street trees, a little park around the corner, access to a private or a private communal garden is far more important than a brilliant park 2 miles away for most people most of the time. Not everyone all the time. And that's not against parks. It's just saying it's that interweaving that really, really matters. And thirdly, everyone agrees in principle that. So we've got the right hooks now at the senior strategic level in the National Planning Policy Framework. We've got a requirement that new streets need to have street trees, which I and others helped put there. However, it's not happening. The amount of urban greenery at best is static. It might even be declining, and the data suggests it's still declining. So two things to find out your question, forgive me. One is we need to create rights in the highways and planning process for parishes, local residents, local shopkeepers to come in and, if you like, guerrilla garden in a legitimate way. At the moment, basically, the highways guys have the right to say no to everything, and because they're taking, and this is not a criticism of the guy, well, maybe it is a bit of a criticism, but because they see the liabilities, and those liabilities are real. Trees do come with costs. They're not seeing the other side of the balance sheet for communities and neighbourhoods, which is very, very real and is countable. They like it's strategic rather than a tree by tree level. So one, create those rights, and there's detail on how to do that. And then two, actually, I think this needs to be something that this government, next government, any government should be taking at a really strategic level and have a national programme of urban regreening. So top down and bottom up. May I say one very quick thing on the brilliant question about Leicester, or have I spoken for too long?
You may go for it.
It's a really important question. I mean, most people's love for new housing is platonic. They love it in principle, but not actually in practice. Given that there's no money, I think here's one key idea, or two key very key ideas. One is, let's sort out Britain's road belt. So in many of Britain's less prosperous towns, there are wide dual carriageways or wide roads going through them. There are far fewer of those in richer towns, because rich people in the 60s were much better at stopping them being built there. They make air quality worse, they break up communities. Very often the poorest communities, if you like, are the wrong side of the road. So that's something that actually saves money rather than costs money. And then if we put if we change the way we model traffic requirements, so we're actually trying to plan for not increasing traffic all the time, and we know that there's a correlation between more use of public transport and more active travel and more prosperous and more productive places. Here's the good news: cycle lanes and public transport in towns and cities is massively cheaper than building huge, great dual carriageways or huge, great roundabouts. I mean, millions, if not billions, cheaper overall. There you go. Two quick thoughts. I'll shush that.
Can't believe I let you plug 2 Create Streets reports on an Onward panel.
Yeah, but I didn't mention the name of the second one. You just had to infer it.
Cheeky. Mark, let me come to you on Ellie's question about, we know that local authorities have a huge amount of requirements and burdens on them. When you engage with local authorities, what are some of the things that they're required to do? You think, look, we could just do away with this. The system would be much simpler if this was streamlined or scrapped altogether. What are some practical things we can change?
Oh gosh, there's probably quite a few of those things. I mean, to me, I think there's probably an opportunity. And speaking as a business that is investing in multiple different locations, for a much greater level of standardisation, that would reduce duplication and tweaking things, and tailoring things. And then if I look at the sheer scale and volume of consultees on basically anything, regardless of almost size of development, and we'll often see perhaps those consultees not necessarily adhering to the theoretical timescale for responses, but then the response does come in. It comes in 2 months after it was meant to come in, but it's still taken into account because otherwise someone's going to challenge the decision at the end. The proportion of things that now get challenged through judicial review is just kind of increasing exponentially. And there'll be certain complex, contentious projects for which that level of rigour will be required, but there will be other smaller ones that perhaps there should be perhaps a more proportionate approach. I just wanted to say something briefly on the greening thing earlier, and if I may, given as I understand that this is an opportunity just to shamelessly plug, I thought I would shamelessly plug.
Only for me.
Our Mayfield regeneration project in Manchester. And I think it's a really good example of a few things that we've talked about. First of all, that is 25 acres of brownfield land, ex-rail industrial use adjacent to the railway line, that's effectively stood derelict and unused for 50 years. Now, I can't give you precise numbers of exactly how many objections there would have been to that, but I can't imagine it was a very significant number, because who fundamentally doesn't think taking something that has been derelict wasteland for the last 5 decades and turning it into a mixed-use neighbourhood, who doesn't think that's a good idea? Yeah. The second thing I just made is the first phase that we delivered for that was a 6.5-acre park, having uncovered a river, invested significantly in tree planting, all the biodiversity benefits that come with that, but also that has now established Mayfield as a place that people actually go and know what it is, rather than the perception of what it may have been a long time before. So I don't think necessarily it's always a case of how you need to kind of force things to happen. I think increasingly developers such as ourselves are seeing that as being a real opportunity to create value. Yeah. And why wouldn't you do? Someone was telling me earlier, I think it was called Parks First or something. I probably got the name wrong, but there was a report going back as far as 2001 that I think was advocating putting that sort of green space in first as the way of, as a catalyst for ultimately driving a more successful project.
And the blue space as well. I mean, Birmingham, where I know better, the kind of uncovering of canals, the regeneration of canals and river and waterways to create that sense of a connection with nature or the natural world more than you might be able to do with parks.
Yeah, and just the impact that has on people's, we mentioned earlier, well-being, quality of life. There's definitely something about having access to those spaces that creates an emotional response in people that you don't get in, heavily concreted environments.
Yeah, absolutely. Anna, let me come to you on this question about fiscal devolution, which was, after all, directed at you. How out of step are we with other countries on the degree to which our local, regional leaders can raise and keep tax revenue, and to what extent is that a problem?
Well, we are a highly centralised economy across policy levers, but particularly on taxes. It's hard to say what's the optimal level because it depends on a number of things, and plus you do need some capacity to redistribute from richer areas to poorer areas. But I think there's a general kind of agreement that a bit more would be good, and this would be materially impacting upon the local incentives for investment, as you said. I think there are also other mechanisms, so things like the infrastructure levy, like other mechanisms for getting some sort of contribution to local communities, or whether it is the commitments to invest in other things alongside a development such as community building, resources, or green space. I think I'd like to add to the green space as well. I think the problem there is that these public goods aren't always internalised by the market and therefore underprovided. But because we know that there are these benefits to health, to our net zero efforts, to well-being, trying to value that better and actually creating, as you said, the maintenance, so the green jobs associated with that, would be a good opportunity, particularly because these are jobs that are spread across the country. So it's a workforce opportunity of the net zero transition and making places better for people.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's take a few more questions. So I'll take another group of three. I've got two up at the front here, and I'll take one more in the group. If anyone has one, I'll take that one there. Excellent.
Hi there, my name is Elliot. I work in policy at the National Trust. Thank you for the mention, Nicholas. I thought it was really good points. Agree with all of it, especially around the resource. And I thought, Mark, especially the point around resource for statutory consultees as well, shouldn't be forgotten when we talk about planning authorities. But I suppose the National Trust, we're working more in cities. We're doing a lot more city-based projects in terms of green space and heritage. How do you make the most of heritage and heritage assets in growth in cities?
Excellent question. Fantastic. Okay, heritage assets in cities. Question next to you there.
I guess a question for Anna, Matt from Grosvenor. Just in terms of the planning system and your reflections from earlier, do you think that what would be most effective for growth is adapting the current system and stripping away some of the complexity, or do you think it's in the UK's long-term interest to move to a more zonal system of planning?
Excellent. Do we adapt the current system or move to a zonal one? And then a third question that was just there in the middle on the left.
Hi, my name's Matt. I'm starting a new charity which improves community green spaces across London. And what we'd love to do is try and get communities involved ex ante rather than ex post, as they normally are. We spoke, I think somebody mentioned maybe a right to garden. There's a community right to bid, but there's not much infrastructure or much guarantee to get communities involved at an early level. I just wondered if there was something I'm missing or maybe something exciting coming up in the future. If you've got any ideas, they'd be very welcome.
I think Nicola's got about 84 pages of ideas on that specific topic. But let's... Mark, on heritage assets, I'm really curious about this because some of the best kind of projects in city centres work with the grain of, kind of brownfield or industrial heritage. Have you had any projects you particularly kind of either maintain, preserve, work with a heritage asset in a site? What did you do? What worked?
Yeah, I think it depends what people mean or take heritage to mean.
Sure.
And at one extreme, I think people can interpret that as being, let's not change anything. This is fantastic. This is the history of this particular place. When I've seen it done particularly well, and I mentioned Mayfield earlier. Mayfield will be a great example of celebrating the heritage of a site. I think when you see a place that has been regenerated, the heritage on which it is based should be a thread that runs through that. But it doesn't mean you've retained it exactly the same and built other stuff around it. You've actually celebrated that, you've interpreted it in terms of what you've brought forward. So, for example, Mayfield, and we have a similar site where we're doing exactly the same thing in Southwark in London. Part of the heritage of that is these fabulous Victorian rail arches. Now, I can assure you, I'm not an engineer, but I can assure you from an engineering point of view, the easiest thing to do would be to get rid of those arches and be able to build from scratch on a cleared site. But actually, when you look at what you can do to incorporate that existing architecture into the design of the places that we're delivering, you find them really inspiring. I'm talking CGIs at this point in time, but you find them really inspiring, uplifting places where you can suddenly see how these things can be woven together. So to me, that when it's done well, is heritage doesn't get in the way, shouldn't get in the way, but it should be a catalyst, but it needs to be looked at in that way rather than, no, let's just kind of retain exactly what we've got because it has some important history from a local context.
I think Andy Haldane sometimes talked about in terms of industrial policy being respectful of the past but not constrained by it. It's like, how do you get that balance? And that seems to be what you're describing. Anna, do we need to adapt our current planning system to make it work or move to a fairly radically different zonal system?
Well, I think... So actually, just to plug an event myself, actually. So there's
We're doing it now.
It's not my event, but it's an event at the LSE on the 5th of December, and it's going to be marking the fact that Paul Cheshire, who's, I'm sure some of you will know, he's an expert on housing as a barrier to growth. It's 40 years since he started working on these topics. It's 20 years since Kate Barker did her first review. And they're going to have this event discussing, why can't we make progress on these things? So I think in some sense it might be wishful thinking to say, let's just go for the wholesale reform, even if that should be an aim. It should be an aim to inform policy, but there are things we can do now as well, and we should be doing those things because the thing is that our productivity crisis is urgent, our need to reduce inequalities is urgent, the climate crisis is urgent, so more things that we can do within the system we have while thinking of the longer term reform seems sensible.
Nicholas?
The two Matt questions. The second Matt question, the greening up one. Yeah, there's a chapter in our report on case studies. So genuinely have a look at that. The ones I'd pick out would be Abundance London. And we didn't actually do a case study on it, but it's easy to Google Todmorden, not a million miles from here. We've actually got an event, if I may, tomorrow. I'm sure it doesn't clash with an Onward event, where Karen from Abundance London and some of the guys who worked on it will be talking. So that's tomorrow at 3 p.m. It's probably the genuine practical advice I could give. Sure. May I just quickly say on the planning very quickly? Yeah. Look, at the moment, it's starting to change cephalogically, but it hasn't flipped. At the moment, the public trust as it would be presented to dismantle the planning system is not there, and it's not about to be there. So my advice to any politician would be don't do that. We've got to work with where we are. And there's lots, as I was saying, I'm conscious that the Chief Executive of the RTPI is right in front of me. There are lots of genuine advantages in our system, but there are just disadvantages as well. Yeah. So my advice to any politician would be, let me give an example of permitted development, which went completely wrong. So permitted development was brought in without any or with very few quality asks with permitted development, and quite rightly, totally predictably, there was a massive pushback when a judge said, I think probably not having windows in this development is probably not great for quality of life, which I think we can probably all agree on. But actually the concept of PD was actually part of this conversation. The idea was, let's make it easy to convert empty space into homes. That, at one level, is completely sensible without having to go through all the planning permission, this, that, and the other. What they should have done, and they are, to be fair, it has now moved back in this direction a bit, was say, let's just have really easy, good, ordinary, utterly set requirements for what you need to do, so that it does actually become, and I use this as a compliment, not as a criticism, a tick box process. So let's take the advantage of the current system for the complex, the weird, the big and the wonderful, the complex heritage sites, but let's find a better way to regulate, not plan in detail, if you like, the good ordinary, so we can create more homes that go with the web and the weave, and we know the web and the weave of how most people want to live, because it's incredibly predictable.
Mark, let me come to you on that question of kind of adapt the current system, move to a zonal one. If you had, in an elevator with Prime Minister, Housing Minister, whatever, and they said, what do you reckon, adapt or new system, what would your answer be?
I'm running a business, you have to be really, but I'm a pragmatist. So I will always try first to adapt and get what you can out of the current system, and we would still feel there is a lot that can be achieved through better resourcing and reducing complexity within the current framework. I think perhaps when you're looking at some of the really major nationally important infrastructure projects that have so many other facets that go with them, I think that's when you're probably perhaps looking at something that needs to be a slightly different approach.
Is it complexity or predictability? Because I think it's very hard to have a planning and regulatory system of the built environment which doesn't have complexity in it. If you think about the size and the scale of the buildings you create, there must be complexity. Isn't it more about predictability than complexity?
Or perhaps it's unnecessary complexity that I would say. So maybe I think we've talked about, I've heard a lot over the last 24 hours about business wanting certainty. I don't think actually we want certainty, and I think certainty is an unrealistic thing to be asking for as a business. At the end of the day, our job is to take risk and manage risk and hopefully deliver a sensible return having managed that risk. I think, but consistency is something that's really important. So I think it's when things are changing, and perhaps the complexity point is, we always see lots of additional asks being layered into thing, but you don't ever see anything taken out. So, and quite often what gets added in, to some extent, overlaps and duplicates something that's already somewhere else within the system. And I think it's that, what I'm perhaps calling complexity, unnecessary complexity.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, we will probably have to wrap up there unless anyone wants to plug any other reports or events or anything similar. All that is left to say 3 quick thank yous. One, thank you to all of you for coming along, asking your questions and contributing. A second, thank you to Landsec for supporting this event, enabling this conversation about a topic that we really care about deeply. So thank you.